when I am blocking in a tree, at the start, what I do is I focus on the basic shape of the tree. I'm going to start with a deciduous tree here. So I'll start with the basic shape of the tree. Now imagine, a trunk coming up, it breaks into branches, those break into smaller branches, those break into the smallest branches. At the end of where, say, the fingers of all those branches go, they often are at similar heights. So if a major branch comes off, it'll make a little section of branches, and those little branches will have, roughly an edge that is the same distance out. So I'm going to start actually here with a tree with no branches on it. Sorry, that looks like this. There we go. Easiest kind of tree to draw. Let's try that again. A tree with no leaves on it. I'm going to draw a tree with no leaves on it, so not the tree with no branches on it. So a tree with no leaves on it. What I'll do is first just block in loosely the general shape of the tree. This is where normally I would be using my Erase non-photo blue pencil. This doesn't show up on this camera very well, so I'm using a little bit of blue lead in a mechanical pencil. This makes a line that is dark enough for you folks to be able to see. If you're looking at it live, you would feel probably that this lead was a little bit too dark. So what I do is I first sort of say that my tree, is it more of an ovally tree, right? Is it more of an ovally tree, or is it more of a vertically tree? Or is it an ovally vertically tree? So you're going to block in the general basic shape of your tree. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to refine this a little bit. As this tree comes up and there are different branches that are going off, so you look at your tree, you'll see clumps of foliage, places where the major branches come off, and that will give you sort of the edges of branches, and these clumps will be sort of ending at different heights. And so it's often useful to think of a set of arcs. A set of arcs that will be tips of branches. And this one here, I'm going to have an arc coming up here. I'm going to have another major arc here and a minor arc there. These arcs are where the tips of your branches are going to be going. So there'll be a major branch coming out to this one, a major branch coming out to this one, a major branch coming out to this one. Different types of trees, the shapes of these arcs, whether they are more flat or whether they're kind of more bowed, will be different with different species of trees. But I think of these kind of the termination zones of a bunch of these branches. And then what I'm going to do is from those arcs, that's where the tips of the branches are, the little branches are going to feed down into bigger ones, to bigger ones, to bigger ones, making their way down to the bottom of the tree. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start up on that line, and I'm going to be taking lines and bringing them down. So first, smaller branches. And as I come down, those are feeding into larger branches. If I'm out actually looking at a real tree, I am also kind of paying attention to sort of where these, what are the angles at which branches connect to each other? Is it a sharp angle like that? Do the branches tend to come in and smack in like that? So that's going to be a real species of tree specific thing. So on some trees, the branches are kind of coming down and they hook into the tree. Other species, they're going to come down and come in here. So I want to pay attention to the angle that things are going to come in. But I'm going to put another little arc here, have another little branch zone kind of come here. You see, what I do is I start up at these tips, and then I feed down, and then I start to bring those together, and then I can smack those into the major trunk. This is different than that approach where you build up the trunk and then you kind of go out to the branches. I like starting where I imagine I am sap kind of flowing down the tree here. And so some smaller branches coming in, those connecting. And then there are going to be a few little kind of branches that are probably hanging off to the side here. Remember, I've got this arc over here, so I'm going to come from that, pull those into larger branches. And if I have a big branch coming into the tree, then the trunk gets wider as well. But I really like this approach of pulling the branches down into that major trunk. If I were doing it with a kind of a taller tree here, here you are enjoying the tree. If you don't want your trees to be floating, put a little bit of ground underneath them and shadow under those trees. Now, let's play with a little bit of watercolor on these trees as well. I have here, make sure that it is working. There is a kind of non-functional water brush floating somewhere around my studio. I want to make sure that I'm not playing with that one when I do a demonstration. I think this will be fine. If I have a tree and here's a few big arcs on it, and it is going to be roughly occupying this area, and I want to hit that fast with a water brush, I'm going to take the tip of my brush. So this brush that I'm using here, this is a Kuretake water brush. And I like these flat water brushes. This particular one, the Kuretake one, has a cap here that if I pick at it, it breaks off. And then I have a big, large mop head brush. I can also take that big brush and splay it like that, um, and have a brush to work with. I kind of often have to hold it down here to kind of keep it splayed. But that's kind of a fun trick. And then take those same bristles, fold it back into a point, put this cap back on. Here again, it is now a chisel brush. Or I can take the cap tip and give it a little turn. And you notice as I do it, it starts to kind of turn into this sort of foxtail thing. Let's take a look at the kind of marks that are made with that. Zoom in on that. You get this sort of very kind of loose, kind of hair-like texture. The more I put on here, the more it turns into a just fuzz ball. But if I have a few of these marks, you get this sort of very interesting random look. So I'm going to, at the top of my tree here, I'm going to come down here and have, in the upper branches of this tree, just a bunch of these little random marks. Now, I spin it back the other way, get my brush back into shape. If you ever have trouble getting your brush back into shape, take the little cap off, point it again, put your cap back on. There, that's what I want. With the edge of a brush like this, I can draw lines. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to attach a few big trunks into here. I'm going to look, and so I've got a bunch of branches in here, and so somewhere in there, there's going to be a few trunk elements coming down. So I'm going from these kind of clusters of little branches and pulling down. Pulling down a little tree. So what I did is I just made some random marks out there. They don't all have to connect into the major trunks. And then I created a sort of trunk elements below that. I'll do that again using both of my little water brushes. So again, a tip here is kind of a random tip of, I get this sort of unplanned branchness effects this way that looks fairly organic. If I am in there with a brush and I'm kind of going, you know, draw a line, it can look rather mechanical. But here I've got this initial layer of outer branches, the thin ones, and then I can also then just take a pointed brush and begin to then come in and drop down. This is kind of a cool branch shape. You often will see this sort of a thing, just sort of sticking out the side of a tree, that where a branch kind of comes out, and then there's a little kind of a curve moment in it like that. Those are cool. They look rather branchy.
Jack, could you talk a little bit about if folks don't have the Kuretake Fude water brush, how else they could make these branches, like those like kind of feathery lines up on top?
Oh, great question.
I also did put the link in the chat if anyone wants to purchase one of those brushes from Jack's store, but in case you don't have one.
So here's just my regular water brush. I could be using just a regular brush. Check this out. If I take the tip of this and I fan it out, I can often get some little wispy lines. Don't quite like that effect quite as much. I like the sort of the random sort of bare branchy effect that I get here with this a little bit more. Similarly, if I have a big brush, so I just had a big brush, I might be able just to take that tip of that big brush, fan it out with my fingers, and hold it like that. And I'll get some of the same not as pleased with that, but so those are
a question here. For those people who aren't using watercolors and they're using colored pencils, do you recommend a way that they can do these trees with colored pencils?
Sure. Let me first clean my brush. Whenever I take a brush apart, I always like to just get the tip of it feeling kind of trained back down again before I go. And watch this, when I put the cap on the brush, come up just slightly. When I put my cap on my brush, what I will often do is first push one side in like that, and just to make sure that I get all those bristles in. I don't want to start putting it on and have some bristles left outside like that. So I will kind of come down here, make sure those are all in. Like to leave it flat. If I train the bristles that way between painting sessions, when I go back to my brush, it will be looking nice and cooperative. I have here a water-soluble pencil. I am going to clean this brush off. There we go. See, you get a little bit of a wash off of that. You can still see your lines that are down below. So here'd be a way with, say, a tool like this, to suggest the same sort of little tiny branches up there. Sometimes when you're a little bit further away, you can't see those individual little branches. So let's say this is a tree that's roughly got this kind of a shape. There's going to be a major arc here, minor arc up here.
Could you push your page up just a little bit? Thank you.
And, right. So I've got an indication of where sort of my major part of my trunk is going to go. And then I am, but not, I don't have to connect this outer part here with this. That I'm going to just sort of let happen from, here I am going to do the same thing now. You see me kind of coming down from that edge. And those then feed into larger branches. From up here, feeding the tips of my trees down, starting to kind of thicken them up and connect them in. So if you're using a water-soluble brush, you could just leave it like this. And if I wanted to, I could, with a pencil, just come along here and smear part of this outer edge. So that makes that now it's just sort of a ghosting. It's a little ghost dusting of those little branches. Maybe there's another little kind of dusting of little branches in there that where those tiny little concentrations of branches are, which you find lots of little ones right out at the edges of the trees. I just smeared it there. I can actually probably do the same thing right over here. You can smear some of these. And that gives you a suggestion that there are some little branches back in there. With the water-soluble pencil, I can do the same thing, just with water. And it gives you a suggestion of the sort of that almost translucent zone where there's just lots of thin little twigs. But instead of drawing in every little twig, I get just sort of a sense of those bare branches in there. So doing this with colored pencil would be the same way as doing it with graphite pencil or this. So beware of the colored pencil. You'll have a tendency to reach for a brown colored pencil because you know that tree trunks are brown. And so we grab our brown pencil and draw in all these brown trunks. The most important thing to reach for when you're looking at your colored pencils is to make sure you're getting the right value. So if it's a dark brown, that is actually more important than it is, the dark is more important than the brown. You can get away with using a purple pencil if it's the right value, and your trees will look like trees out there. But just because they are trees and wood doesn't make them um, doesn't is not going to make it look. You won't get that just by turning your tree brown. So if it's dark values, the most important thing is to get those dark values. Oh, just one little. I'm actually going to add some color to this. Sometimes with, say, willow trees, different species of willows, the final branches out at the tips are red, some of them are orange, some of them are more yellow. So sometimes in winter trees, you'll see just this little kind of blushes of a little bit of color in winter trees, and that's from the twigs. So you can get, if I draw in these little twigs as little orange lines, it's going to feel like there's like, what are all those orange lines doing in the top of your tree? Sometimes you can just put in a blush of that color. And gives you a sense of seeing that color in the finest branches out there. Let's put a few more leaves on these trees. I find that if I draw in all the trunks of the trees and then put the leaves on top of them, I don't like the way it looks. And the reason is that when the leaves are off the tree, I see the full skeleton of the tree. But when the leaves are on the tree, my view of that skeleton is partially obscured by the leaves. So if I've drawn in the trunks first, that's going to actually create problems for me. So just remember, before we leave these, again, these major arcs, this arc is because there's this major branch that is coming off. This major branch is responsible for this arc. This major branch coming off here is responsible for this arc. This major branch coming off here. So in those arcs on the top of the trees, those are a reflection of the major branching systems of that tree. So you want to relate your trunks to those arches. And that is a really good thing that happens almost automatically when you're using this technique of drawing the arch and then pulling the little branches down from it, connecting them into the trunk. You build this structure because you're starting out there with the, essentially the first order streams coming into the second order streams, into the major tributaries, into the river. Let's take a tree and put a few more leaves on top of it. This is going to be a broadleaf deciduous tree. I'm going to start roughly the same way. I'm going to start off just saying that, all right, this tree, it's got an overall broad shape. It's got an overall broad shape. And then can I see sort of a reflection of sort of major zones of that tree, major kind of arcs in it, major clumps? This tree is going to have one big kind of clump zone over here, another kind of clump zone over here, and a third minor one over here. So I do that lightly. I want to try to avoid a tree structure that will be where I'll have three balls that are the same size. I want to kind of be thinking consistently inconsistent. So maybe there's one big mass of my tree, there is a smaller one, and then there's a third. So you can think Papa Bear, Mama Bear, Baby Bear. Maybe there is a major part here, all right, and there is going to be sort of another little sidecar there. Maybe there's a minor part in here. But I want to think of, as I'm building my trees, of visually breaking up. I want the major masses of the trees not to be symmetrical. If you do, it'll look like somebody's topiary project. Or, worse, the ice cream cone tree. Here's the triple scoop, right? I'm going to avoid that tree. So this major part here, I can see part. I'm going to look at. I'm going to be able to see part of the trunk coming up, and with my blue pencil, I'm going to say that, all right, this part here, there's one kind of trunk element that is coming down here. This part is going up, and it is breaking out something like this in my tree. So the good news is that you've got a real tree and you're able to see where it is. Don't draw these lines really heavily, and don't draw them all the way to the edges, because towards the edges they're going to be super obscured by leaves. But this gives me some major trunk elements. So I'm going to have one part here that's supplying this, one part coming up here that's supplying this, and then breaking off, supplying this. Right. Now, what I'm going to do is draw over this with my graphite pencil. And by the way, as I'm doing this, I'm not looking at any reference material. This is a made-up happy tree. And so when I'm out in nature, the answer of how you draw your trees is not in my head. It is, so I'm not recommending to anybody here that you just kind of come up with, like, here's a trick with your brush, a formula for drawing trees. Look at the real tree, right? And you want to look at the real tree instead of just sort of having a tree formula. That is going to make your trees work. But these general principles that that you see, those can inform and help you then be able to sculpt. So you want to sort of have these ideas in mind, but always kind of go back to looking at the real trees. But when you're in doubt, you can always just sort of fall back on drawing your happy trees. All right, here we go. In this clump of foliage, I suggest that you, as an artist, you spend some time doodling and you develop your own leafy doodle. And what I want you to do is to be able, with your pencil, to make a line that is sometimes broken, sometimes feels a little bit leafy, is fast for you to make. But look at this little line kind of coming along here, right? Whoa, I mean, it's a little kind of, I'm not doing this. That's what you do not want. Just say no to that line. Instead, I've got this little kind of leafy squiggle, and I kind of just, a great little doodle is just to kind of be able to, in some part of your paper, just go around like that and see what happens. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this line energy and I'm going to come over to this tree. And I can put some of that same line energy around here. Around that clump, around this clump here. And then I can use that same line energy to introduce some holes in my foliage. So this one here is going to have, there's going to be a hole here. We're going to see some of that trunk going through. What about I make a little hole right there where some trunk goes through? So I want a mass of foliage, and I'm going to pop a few sky holes into it. So what you want to think of the shapes of the mass of the tree and the shapes of your sky hole. So I've got a sky hole here, major sky hole here, sort of secondary sky hole right in there. All right? Then you're going to be able to have some trunk that you can see through those sky holes. So imagine I'm going to draw just a few kind of quick sky holes here. Let's say there's a sky hole here. There's a couple sky holes here. I'm not so much worried about the shape of these sky holes, but what can be going on in these? You can see part of, this trunk through here and that. You're going to see through this other one. You want to think of what are you going to see through those sky holes. And a major trunk is coming along here. I often draw these sort of sections of trunk that you're seeing through the sky holes as fairly dark and black. And the reason is that they're underneath the canopy of the tree and they're in the shade. Similarly, this part of the trunk here coming in underneath here, it's in the shade. And as you get there underneath the tree, you're in the shade. So right where those trunks are coming in under the trees, I can pop that contrast. Boom, right in there. Pop some contrast in there. Let's say the light is coming from this direction here. That means on this side of the tree, there's going to be more shadow. And around this little sky hole here, I'm going to pop in some shadow. I want to have that nice contrast right next to the sky hole. Similarly right here next to this sky hole here, a little bit of pop in some contrast. And then as we're getting up here on the outer surface of the tree, a little bit less contrast. Right now it's a floating tree. If I give it a shadow underneath it, so just some shadow, a little indication, some vertical lines here, and like, oh look, now it's on grass, right? That's because there are a few little lines like that. And if I put a cow, there will be scale. Cow likes to hang out underneath the trees. If you do a little value sketch like this, you can leave it as a pencil sketch and it works. Actually, it'll work even better if I hit this value right here, kind of get a few more, just pop some extra dark on the ground there. And if it is fall, on the East Coast, they probably still have some green in the grass. I need to go and look at some East Coast forests and wander around out there in some meadows. But if you have a drawing like this, you can just come along and tint it. I'm going to take my brush, wipe a little bit of that green off, and above that, I'm going to put in some sort of brown in the sky back here. That might be sort of a distant forest that you're looking at. And for whatever colors your tree is turning, you can just take that tree and tint it. If my tree is turning yellow, you've already established all the values with your pencil. Maybe there's some parts that are turning more orange. Since I'm adding color to it, I probably should add just a little bit of color to my shadows. I'm going to put some blue into those shadows. Get those to stand out a little bit more. Didn't have to add watercolor to it. Would have worked as a graphite pencil drawing. But again, once if you do establish all your values with your pencil, then you can just drop you can just tint on top of it. Think of it like tinting an old black and white photograph. You didn't have to muck around too much with the drawing is essentially carried by the pencil. Look now at the power of those sky holes. You just sort of imagine those those branches coming up. And also notice how nice it is to have those dark values on the trunks below the foliage. You then feel it that those are actually casting a shadow down onto the surfaces below them. Um, Melinda, do you see any other comments or questions that are related specifically to this kind of part of the drawing process?
No, I think you've answered it. They were asking about the adding leaves to this and talking about colored pencil. Um, we're at 12:55 right now,
All right.
and I know that you were hoping to get to kind of
Oh,
middle
I
distance
don't. I always,
trees,
yeah.
so
I
that could
was
you
going to
might
do
have to go
deciduous
another.
trees and then coniferous trees, and then
Yeah,
also have time to kind of do distant trees and things. So let's, time is
but this is really
always slips
great, Jack,
away from me.
for us to just we have
I think
enough
we
to
probably want to
practice
just
with.
call it a wrap here.
Yeah.
So those are your happy trees for today, and we hope that you had a good time exploring those. The like right over here, that would be a good place for a squirrel to live. We could just put one in right there. All right. So I hope you had fun with this today. And this is the official Bob Ross action figure that Beth and Roseanne gave me at the end of the Wild Wonder Conference. My two daughters love playing with the Bob action figure. It comes also with its own palette and three brushes. So that's pretty exciting. So I hope you enjoyed these happy trees. Let me just pop over to the. I'd say the most important thing about drawing trees is to look at the real trees, right? Don't just like, oh, I need a tree, and put in like a formula for a tree shape. You look at the real tree, but then you can use this bag of tricks to help you sculpt and form that in a way that is going to be is going to be more these tricks will help you kind of get what you see down on the piece of paper. The idea of looking for these kind of arcs at the tops of the trees and drawing down your branches below those is gold. That really helps me with my trees, because then I get a relationship between the upper architecture of the trees and all the way down to the final trunk. I find sometimes when I'm starting with the trunk and going up, I end up with, there's no real structure to my upper canopy. The bottom part of my tree, it's got real roots and a base, but there's no real relationship between that and what's going up. And you wouldn't need a trunk that is that big to get to just that sparse bit of foliage that I have there. So that's why I like working from the edges down. So you imagine that you are a little molecule of some sugars that have been formed by the tree. So the tree's gone, it's collected carbon out of the air. Isn't that cool? The tree is collecting carbon out of the air, grabbing that carbon out of the air, and as you're drawing, you're tracing the little root of those little pieces of carbon as they're going down, as sugars down the trunk into the base of that tree.